So here we are, the last official lecture of NORWAC. And I guess I just want to ask everybody, are you exhausted? Yeah, I'd say I see some nods, I see some winks. Speaking of exhausted, oh, what was it, Sam? 4 or 5 years ago, we were at a NORWAC together. And any of you who've been to live NORWAC would know that there's a lot of partying on Saturday night, and people usually don't toddle off to bed till, and anyway, a lot of fun. It's not just about, partying, it's fun partying. And then the hotel starts to clear out and da da da. I was flying out the next day, Tuesday, and the lobby is where everybody hangs out at the bar, and there was nobody left. And I see these little feet sticking off a couch, and I was like, I wonder, is that somebody we know? And I go over there, and I hear snoring, and yes, it's Sam. It's Sam snoozing on one of the couches in the lobby. And I looked at Sam, and I woke him up, and what was funny was, he jumped up and he looked at his watch and then said, I'm going to be late for my plane, and took off. So I was glad I woke him up. But I recently saw Sam's chart, and it made a lot of sense to me because he has Neptune conjunct his sun, and he's a Pisces ascendant. But that aside, Sam has lots of reasons to be exhausted. If you don't know all of the things that he has his hands in, many of you very appreciative of what he's brought to this conference, not just from his lectures, but from the panel that he put together, and with the masterful way that he put that together and managed it and brought the topic forward. He is also ESAR certified. He is on the board of directors for ESAR and the International Academy of Astrology, and he's the founder of the International Society of Black Astrologers, and he teaches on the International Astrology Academy, and he writes for journals and magazines, and I know he's an icon on social media. And if you aren't exhausted just hearing all of that, your Mars in Capricorn, you really give that a good workout, Sam. And we're all looking forward to what he has to say. Thank you for all your contributions to the community. And we will now learn about our crosses to bear.
All right. Thank you for that beautiful introduction, Patricia. I mean, you brought it back to my memory, that whole event. And you nailed it with the Sun-Neptune conjunction. One of my superpowers is that I have had the fortune of being able to sleep anywhere, nearly anywhere. And, on a boat, gagged and put in a closet. That's a different story for a different time.
Oh, maybe that'll be the next intro.
So, yeah, that's kind of a thing. So I'm glad you shared that memory. So hello, everybody. I'm going to talk with you about our crosses to bear, the Cardinal, Fixed, and Mutable cross. And I want to open up with welcome to Jesus Camp. It was all a lure, a trick to get you here to talk about Jesus, and so that you can redeem your souls. No, when I say I'm kidding, I'm really kidding. And just as a backstory, because I'm sure the natural result is like, wait, what's going on? Why are we talking about Jesus here? We're really not going to be. But my introduction to talking about crosses came from when I was a young minister. And when I say a young minister, I went into the ministry, Christian ministry, when I was 12 years old. I left it when I was 19. So my first encounter with the idea of three crosses was dealing with the death of Jesus, situated between two supposed evildoers or thieves, depending on which scripture you read, who were crucified with him. So that was my introduction to it. But it became a little more complicated, a lot more nuanced with my introduction and study of Alice Bailey. Now, this may surprise some of you who know me on social media, who've studied with me, who who know that I'm more now a traditional astrologer, but just to give you a little backdrop, I moved to Santa Fe May 3rd, but I came out here because I have been studying with an astrologer who was very steeped in the Alice Bailey tradition. I have been studying with him for about 3 years at that point, and came to Santa Fe in 2002 in order to continue my studies with him. So many of you may like, no, you were really into the woo stuff? Yes, I was really into the woo stuff at one particular point. And so my introduction was into the notion that Alice Bailey shares about the crosses. So first, let's just talk a little bit about who is Alice Bailey. So her teachings were transmitted to her by a master of wisdom that she identified as Dwaj Kul. It is not clear whether Dwaj Kul was actually incarnated at that time, speaking to her or transmitting his thoughts to her. She was a manuresis, that was her official title. Or he was an ascended master and was not on this earthly plane at that particular point. But he talked with her about the modalities, or what we used to call the quadruplicities, as analogs for the soul's development from an aspirant, someone who is on the path or not even completely on the path, but who may come to be aware of the deeper meanings related not just to life, but to the soul's evolution, to a disciple, to someone who is exactly on the path, to an initiate. Now, one thing I want to emphasize before I go deeper into this, as I'm going to talk to you about the 3 crosses, the quadruplicities, on the angles of your chart, depending, whatever house system you may use, and I'm going to make allowance for different kinds of house systems, so don't worry about that. But I do want to say they're analogs. So if you are very strong in mutability, what I'm about to share with you that Alice Bailey says, I don't want you to take as rigid and thinking like, oh, I'm just on the level of personality, because that's not what she meant if you read her actual books and writings. What she makes clear is that at any particular point, you could be along the fixed cross, for example, but have mutable angles and have that related to the mutable cross. So again, just to break that down, if you're a Scorpio rising and you in turn have Virgo as your midheaven or something like that, that doesn't mean then that, because you're on your Scorpio, a fixed sign, that you can't participate also in the mutability. I'm going to clarify that a little later in terms of looking at all the dimensions, but it's more an analogy, and you should embrace it as such rather than some rigid notion or demarcation of who and what you are. So from the ageless wisdom teachings of Alice Bailey, she makes 3 interesting distinctions about what each of these relate to. And again, to understand this tradition, it is to recognize that it is very much steeped in the idea of the Christ myth and the Christ idea. I'm going to go beyond that, so don't worry that I'm just going to leave it at like, well, y'all need to come to Jesus, because I'm not going back into my preaching days. I mean, after all, I'm a Muslim, so it's completely different now. Like, you've been through a lot. Well, that's a different story. So let's start with the mutable cross and what she really ties in with that. She calls that the cross of the hidden Christ, which I love. That it's something that is not yet manifest, perhaps deep within us. And it relates to the transforming of the common or unfocused energies of something that she called, and then other traditions that I've seen, even my Kabbalah teacher, calling it the animal man or the animal person, if you're going to get away from gender, into an aspirant. Of those constantly altering environments which drive the soul within the form, meaning the soul within like a body, from one extreme of experience to another, shuttling between opposites. So this is the idea from this typography of what mutable means. To be on the fixed cross is the cross of the crucified Christ, which is Jesus literally on the cross, is the path of the disciple, the cross of the soul rather than the personality, distinguishing it from the mutable. Its fixed vision and of that immovable intent, which draws the man from the points of light to blazing solar radiance. So this is where now you're set with purpose, with clarity toward the idea of achieving a particular goal as supposedly Christ was on the cross, committed to transmitting the energies of the solar system itself for change, sensitive to the larger whole. So something is shifted when we move along the fixed cross according to this typography, which is that you're not just living just for yourself. To become a disciple means that you're an active agent of change, that you're very interested in shaping the world, and that is energy that is transmitted through you. And then at the same time, the energy that you transmit from within yourself into the world, or back into the cosmos. And then as you go toward the cross of the risen Christ at the cardinal cross, this is the path to becoming an initiate into higher orders and realms as the spirit is crucified, reaching at one-ment, as she puts it, with all enlightened ones, which means most often ascendant masters and beyond, and transcending nature itself, the material world, that which is around you. And the image that I do love related to the idea of the cardinal cross is that it's a picture of widespread arms, the open heart, and the higher mind. And this is where you become part of the work that is not just on the material plane of unfolding the higher phases of being. If you've ever heard of something, I know, Patricia, you've actually used this because I saw it either on Facebook or somewhere else. If you've ever used the Great Invocation, right, or seen something called the Great Invocation, when you talk about the plan and the higher plane, that's what she's also talking about in terms of unfolding the higher phases of being. Okay. I'm not checking the chat, so I don't know if you guys are having any questions. If the room monitors or Patricia let me know that there's something pressing, I will definitely address it if something's not clear. Because now I'm going to move on from talking about Alice Bailey to giving a different sense of it, of the quadruplicities or the modalities. So I am going to get a little more metaphysical here, so allow me to indulge a little more in terms of understanding the metaphysical idea of the modalities. So the power of three reveals how the dynamism of spirit manifests itself also in nature, as also going beyond nature. And I was drawing in from scripture where three or more are gathered in my name, as Jesus says. It does this through the manifestations of the cardinal fixed and mutable energies. The analogies might be, I don't like to get too hardwired into this, the Trinity, the triumvirate of Hindu gods, the states of matter, in terms of whether it's something is solid, liquid, or gas. And even though I make mention of the seasons related to each of these, I want to go beyond that, because if we were talking about it in a sidereal sense, it wouldn't necessarily be the start of spring or summer for Cancer or fall for Libra. And also, if we're talking about it in the Southern Hemisphere, being attentive to our Southern neighbors, they're also kind of different in their meanings. So the nature of these modalities are not just tied to the seasons, but something even more primal, which is ultimately what I'm also getting at in terms of understanding these three crosses that we bear, either individually or even collectively. But we do see that, and we'll reiterate this again, the outline of what are the cardinal signs, what are the fixed signs, and then what we have as the mutable signs. But they bleed into something interesting, which is called the tetragrammaton. And this tetragrammaton is what's believed to be, or what in one particular tradition of Judaism, as the name of God. And we say that it is starting, because Hebrew, and this is Hebrew, just to be clear, it's read from right to left. So this would be the first letter here, if you can see my cursor, Yod, He, Vav, He, right? And so we have 4 letters there total, but really just 3 are used. So I think this is kind of a reflection of a dynamic between 3 and 4 that I will come back to. Interestingly enough, in Arabic, related to what Muslims use as the name for God, which is Allah, it's also 3 letters, but 3 letters used in the permutation of 4, meaning that there are actually 4 letters that appear. So, and again, those of you who may not be familiar with that tetragrammaton, you might know it in its spelled out form in English, which might be blasphemy for some Jews, right? Because they don't often say the name or it's said only by certain people on certain occasions. And the way we have it, I was almost going to call it the corruption, but maybe that's not fair. We say Jehovah. But again, Jehovah is not from the actual Hebrew because there's no J. And as any of you who might remember Indiana Jones, there's no J in Hebrew. So with the idea of the three, we go toward the four. So we're dealing with the dynamic of these three energies that relate and work on matter or work with matter, which is like how we have four things, you know, a base related to materialization, and four usually represents the foundation of spirit and form, as I say here, as we talk about four elements, the four qualities which are that make up the four elements: hot, cold, dry, and wet. And that goes into something that I think, to understand a dynamism of energy, especially starting with the quadruplicities, with the three, with the modality, you know, and we see this, you know, I've actually taught my students that one of the keys to understanding astrology, as we currently talk about it in the West, is looking at the four elements matched with three aspects of being to produce the 12 signs. 4 + 3 equals the 7 harmonics of the planets. 4 - 3 speaks of the one. So getting deeper back into the idea of the three, the cardinal, the fixed, the mutable, I want to take something also from Tim Addy's book, The Unfolding Wings, The Way of Perfection in the Platonic Tradition. And there's a couple of things that might interest astrologers. If you recognize the last name, you're like, Tim Addy, I know that name. That is John Addy's son, who actually is known for developing harmonics in astrology, which is kind of related to, when we say harmonics, we're talking about mainly the idea of aspects, but going beyond just the Ptolemaic aspects, but being able to look at quintiles, looking at septiles, those kinds of things. So this is his son, and he's steeped also in, not so much in astrology, but unearthing Platonic ideas as illuminated through astrology. In one particular form he talks about is called the dialectic. Now, many of you who have studied Plato know about the idea of the dialectic, and we talk about dialectic materialism. We also talk about Hegel, you know, in terms of dealing with the dialectic, but the classical notion of the dialect, or dialectic, sorry, is as a means for the rational creature, ideally the human, to retrace the unfolding of monadic ideas. So in the monad, even though that's something that's also in the ageless wisdom teachings of Alice Bailey, is something that's also steeped in the Neoplatonic and Platonic tradition. And what I found fascinating is that in that particular tradition of talking about a dialectic, you're concentrating or focusing on three questions. What happens, meaning something has been initiated, or that's cardinal. What does not happen, and this was, as someone who has a good number of fixed signs, I recognize we often talk about fixed signs as what situates something into place, but not what prevents something else from happening. So the idea of this dialectic of, you know, shaping something by, I would say, assertion, positive assertion, it also does something by resistance as a negative decline, as meaning prevents something from happening. And the mutable is kind of in between the two. What does and does not happen. So it can alternate, as we often talk about. So this plays into something else that Addy illuminates as part of the idea of the dialectic, where we look at the elements a little differently. So the elements play out in four relationships for each of these questions. So if you were doing an examination of what is the soul, what you would do as part of the dialectic is that you would entertain these three questions in relation to four forms or four relationships. To the thing itself, in terms of itself, fire. To the thing itself, in terms of its relationship to other things, which we would identify as air. To other things in terms of themselves, which we would talk about as water. And to other things in terms of the originating thing, which we could say as earth. And this is also following a kind of order that goes from fire to earth, and in that particular fire, air, water, earth order. So with this, we can see that just in terms of affirming something, we get something comparable to the 12 signs of the zodiac. Now, again, if you were to examine what the soul is not, what is not like unto the soul, you would also do those 3 particular questions with those 4 relationships and have a total of 24 permutations, but that's not the astrology we do. So this is more just to understand a different notion of it. So that brings us to trying to understand, how does this play out in our lives? Like, just to give a different, and I hope fresh notion of appreciating these crosses. And just to make it simple, if you have at your angles before cardinal signs, or the 4 fixed signs, or the 4 mutable signs, then this is what I'm talking about with you. So for instance, Patricia mentioned my chart. I am a Pisces rising, Sag is at the top of my midheaven. I am technically with my chart on a mutable cross. Now, again, with that designation, that doesn't mean then that, I'm just dealing on the level of the personality, and that I'm not even an aspirant yet, or even a disciple. It could be, as I said, that you could be on the analog of a particular cross, but on the path, if you're following this kind of typography, on the level of soul as a disciple. But this is for you just on the level of looking at the chart, like, well, yeah, I'm Aries rising. I have Capricorn at the midheaven. So this is what I'm talking about. Before I get into, and just to be clear, I should say this because we have all kinds of people at NORWAC. When I say all kinds of people who just like, I just heard about this conference and I just showed up, and I don't know much about astrology at all. So the cardinal signs are Aries, Cancer, Libra, Capricorn. This is a typography, some kind of idea that I've been working with for a number of years. It is I won't explain too much of it, but I'm referencing it and then showing it to you because it's a way of looking at the planets in a dynamic that relate to the moon and the sun, to the idea of aspiring and then embodying, as we see from the moon, as also related to the signs, and then some succinct way of talking about the planets. Venus related to pleasure, Mars related to struggle, thought with Mercury, as manifested with what's within, as within, also without or outside of us. And then Jupiter related to understanding, and Saturn kind of like straddling between that dynamic as the synthesis point or the concretization of something related to worldly wisdom, dealing with form. So that brings us to, in understanding the cardinal planets, the planets that are involved in their rulership. And just for those who may not know, or I don't want anyone confused, I do stick to traditional rulers. So when we get to, I think in this particular case, there are no need to use any modern rulers with the cardinal signs, but just when we get to the fixed signs and the mutables, you'll understand why. So Mars in terms of that energy related to struggle, this is related to the idea of energy of Aries. And then when we talk about the moon, the idea of dealing with the idea of form. One of the things that we often talk about with the moon is definitely nurturing. We also talk about the moon in relation to the quality of emotions, but that is a way of also understanding form and things kind of going from more pure abstraction of spirit into different levels of form. This is why sometimes even more on the emotional plane might be also called the astral plane in terms of how we embrace things. And then we have Venus in terms of how that form is shaped related to what is pleasurable or beautiful, or even in terms of the powers of attraction. Saturn, also I talked about in terms of worldly wisdom and concretizing things and putting things to shape, also deals with the idea of time. But one of the fascinating things as a tie between Saturn and the moon is the concept of time itself. The moon in terms of its 28, 29 days, and then for Saturn, it's 28, 29 years. So when we have the idea of cardinality, there is a certain awareness, not just related to form and having to make form, but also consciousness of time. So how does that manifest? It manifests as a pursuit of manifesting a new identity in time and space along the nature of an element, whether that's Cancer for water, or Libra for air, or Capricorn for earth, and Aries for fire. So there's often a sense of urgency, and action is the key pursuit, and can get bored and restless or anxious when things get too quiet or contained, because time, right? They're aware of time. And this is why I also say there's no time like the present, or YOLO, you only live once. So that is something that is striking in understanding related to the cardinal cross. Also, the shortest distance between 2 points is a line, right? In terms of wanting to take action and wanting to make things move forth. Struggles with finishing things because, again, they're aware of time and they have so many different things in terms that help in the creation of their new identity or renewing their identity, that they may lose track of completing things and continuing that energy. And their impulse control can kind of get out of whack. And so they just think about doing the next thing. So I just was talking to someone along the Cardinal Cross today, and she talked about, and she's gone through different permutations related to her life. And was like, yeah, I think I might just quit my job soon if certain things don't change. So there's a certain impulse toward action and making it happen. So I got to put, I don't know if Laura's fully on the Cardinal Cross, but is she very strong in cardinality? And so putting together something like NORWAC and other things, or UAC, being an executive, making things happen. This is something that's very strong for her. And also in general, for cardinal signs and those operating along the Cardinal Cross. So I decided to pick an example related to the Cardinal Cross, and this is Malcolm X, Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz. Now, one of the reasons why I picked him is not so much because, he was a radical leader and he challenged and he stirred up things, but I want to go back and talk a little bit about Malcolm's story. Not the whole story, because, I only have an hour, so I'm not going to go too deep into this. But as you can see, and we have a birth time for him based on one particular reading of a birth certificate. Now, it either says AM or PM, and some people use the AM chart, which would make him, I believe, a Leo rising, and some people use this chart. I like this chart for a number of reasons. But one of the main reasons I want to bring home is with the cardinality in terms of being a person of action and having a sense of awareness, and Jupiter being in its fall in his first house. One of the things, and I've talked about this before, especially at NORWAC, I've talked about Jupiter returns. He came to the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, or learned of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad at his Jupiter return when he was 23 years old. And one of the striking things about Malcolm's life as related to displaying that cardinality was that, I will say this, and I think this is on record from many people saying this as well, the Nation of Islam was a fledgling organization when Malcolm joined it, meaning that it had maybe a few chapters. When Malcolm got involved in the Nation of Islam, it went from that fledgling organization to having nearly 1 million members in it. In other words, he built the Nation of Islam, right? He was under the tutelage of someone he thought of as a master, in terms of someone he submitted to him, trusted explicitly in terms of building this organization. But let me go back. Now, those of you who know a little bit about the nation know that it's an organization that is dedicated for the uplift and prosperity of Black people, or those who are lost in the wilderness of America, explicitly. But Malcolm X is the son of 2 Black nationalists who were also under the guise and training of Marcus Mosiah Garvey. Now, why that's significant is that in terms of tracing his lineage, and I also say that Jupiter in Capricorn is the path of the standard bearer, he felt his cross to bear was related to action in making something happen related to like his particular interest was, which was Black liberation. But he felt like he had to do it under somebody else's auspices, which was the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. When he, just a little bit after his third Jupiter return, he actually became disillusioned and had reason to be, I won't go into here, with the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, and started going along his own path, discovering his own sense of Islam, until ultimately, near the end of his life, he creates his own organization. And that's why I wanted to use this chart, because his maturation on the cardinal cross was to forge his identity on his terms, not someone else's, which he did. So we often lament, like he died, you know, because he died at 39, he died too soon. And I sometimes have that sentiment, but he may have died fulfilling his soul's purpose and then had no other thing that he needed necessarily to do. I mean, we may have felt that he did, but that's a different matter. So meet the fixed cross. This is along the trajectory of dealing with those who are born perhaps with Taurus, Leo, Scorpio, or Aquarius at the angles, and then ideally those signs being at the angles. Again, the angles, just to be clear, is either the ascendant, then the IC, or the nadir, or we would call the descendant, the 7th house, or the 10th house, the MC, or the midheaven. So with those particular signs operating at those angles, we're dealing with a certain level of power that it's shaped by these 4 planets: Venus, Sun, Mars, and Saturn. So with Venus, again, we have this the power of attraction. Let's go over to what's familiar. And then Mars, we also have the sense of, you know, that push, that struggle of making things happen. What's different, you might say, like, well, what's the energy? This is much more internal. You know, Venus relates to Taurus through more what we call her night home, which is much more receptive. Mars through Scorpio, which is also more receptive. Whereas it's flipped for Saturn, because he's in an earth sign along the cardinal axis for Capricorn, but he's now in an air sign, which is supposed to be much more assertive in its idea, and opposing that, but also aware of time, the things that we said before. But the sun is the life giver, is where we have like the sense of complete raw energy and the manifestation of energy and how it functions in our life, the sense of power, the sense of verve, and even joy. So that leads us to a different understanding of the fixed cross, which I call the purposeful course, because it's infused and dictated by purpose. So the idea of the pursuit of stabilizing, maintaining, and developing what's been initiated, ideally by the cardinal signs, but hard for those who are on the fixed cross sometimes to see when routine has become a rut. So they strive to create more than just one straight line between 2 points, like the cardinal, and to establish more purpose and an eye on persistence. You can say, well, what do you do between having more than, one line? Well, you create a square, of course, right? Or you create a sense of foundation, or you might create something much more elaborate, like a hexagon or whatever, in order to kind of create more sense of stability than just a line. And then it goes with a particular statement that the race is not to the swift or the strong, but to those who endure to the end. And you may have heard that. This is a side note, but for me, a former preacher, funny related, I used to hear this all the time in church, and people saying, like, yes, the scripture says that the race is not to the swift. I just want to tell you, it's not in the Bible at all. Part of it is, but that statement, it's not in the Bible. So that's just a sidebar. So, but it does capture the idea of what fixity is about. Waste not, want not, or time is money, as converse to like YOLO. So there's again, because of the Saturn part of the fixed cross, there's awareness about time, but it's dealing with some measure of worth or value or sustenance. Resistance is never futile, right? So That's something that may often be very strong in the idea of the fixed cross. But that doesn't mean it has to be a way of life all the time either. So for those of you who said like, no, I'm not budging from this spot during the storm, you might need to go toward the next thing I'm saying, which is, learn to let go, stop struggling so much with change, and learn to embrace a little more flexibility and adaptation. So the example I like to give about the fixed cross is none other than the lady, Tina Turner. And I've talked about her here at NORWAC before, but as you can see, she has fixed signs at all her angles. And what I would play for you, if I could trust audio and everything with this computer, would be the version of Proud Mary that she used to sing with Ike Turner, which I think really captures the persistence, the determination, the sense of purpose, and finding a sense of purpose that is everything associated with Tina Turner, right? Many of you may not know, or many of you may know, this is a woman who was in an abusive relationship with someone she shared a creative life and had created a life together with, Ike Turner, who was also very fixed, a Scorpio, and escaped that and essentially escaped to nothing. When I say nothing, basically the clothes on her back, and also she had children with Ike and also his children that she also jointly was raising, but he wouldn't let her see the children and wouldn't let her access even any of her money. The only thing he allowed to keep was in terms of some measure of her name, the Turner. And this is a woman who had to reinvent herself pretty much from the late 70s into the 80s and create more her own sense of self, and culminating with her book, I, Tina, and then also in terms of her movie, What's Love Got to Do with It? So you see the staying power, that determination. And she also found in her practice of Nichiren Buddhism a sense of purpose in terms of the development and the unfolding of her life. Again, that's the power of the fixed cross. Even though, yes, she's also got strong mutability, her sun, Mercury, Venus, opposite her, she's a full moon baby. But again, in terms of how she unfolded her sense of life, that was along the fixed cross. Then we have the mutable cross, which features Gemini, Virgo, Sagittarius, and Pisces. So we have then again, still the replication of air, earth, fire, water, as we've done with the others. But we have something that's different. Only 2 planets involved in the traditional playing out of these 4 signs, Mercury and Jupiter, planets that we've not talked about before, right? So Mercury dealing with the idea of thought and communication. I think we've been talking probably a lot about Mercury since we're just in his retrograde now. And the way, I think of Mercury and talk about Mercury as connecting anything that goes from A to B. So that deals with the 3 comms: communication, commerce, and commuting. So if there's any way in which we have to put things together, that's what Mercury does, right? Or we have Nicholas Palomonakos. And then Jupiter, right? Jupiter is more so the idea where we have expansion, growth, how we have different broader notions of understanding, which is also key in looking at Jupiter. So it's not just an awareness of time and sense of urgency, as we talked about with cardinality and fixity, but with mutability, it's dealing with idea of change and knowledge and understanding with the intention related to growth. So this is the pursuit of refining, understanding, and exploring. Let me move this out the way. For stages, dealing with the stages of initiation. Strives to cycle through the vagaries of change and stability in order, that's to say. They're more likely to move in circles. Yeah, so in other words, they're actually more likely to move in circles rather than just going from a straight line like cardinality, because they deal with these cycles of change and change and stability. they move in a more elliptical fashion. And by the way, I call the mutable cross the experiential course. So when you're born on the mutable cross, as I have been, right? And I mentioned to you, I was a preacher. And then it's like, okay, you were a preacher and now you're a Muslim. Well, between that, I was also an atheist, a professor, a poet. And, you know, I would look at my life, and I know many people who are on the mutable cross, and like, do I really know what I'm doing? I don't know if I know what I'm doing. Where am I going? And the other way in which that might also be, you know, you meet people on the cardinal or fixed cross, and like, well, Susie knew she wanted to be a lawyer when she was 6. I'm still figuring it out. I'm 56. I don't know what I'm going to do. That could be someone who's also operating on the mutable cross. Keeping it moving. The idea is more the merrier in terms of the phrase that might go along with them. The challenges, again, or I should say what comes up for them. How do you get past it? Well, procrastination, continuously processing, and avoidance must transform into baby steps and not giving up. Some measure of the cure is realizing that, you know, you don't always have to take the grand steps that maybe a cardinal sign or someone on the cardinal cross may do. And you don't always have to just fear, you know, that you won't have the stamina. It may be that you may use that notion of cycling to cycle back. Sort of like how we do when we talk about colleges, at least in the States, when we go to college. You don't have history every single day, usually, right? You may have it on Mondays and Wednesdays. You may have another thing that happens on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and then something completely different on Friday. So sometimes operating along the mutable cross requires that you take baby steps and cycle through things. Now, with the other things, just to be clear, like with the fixed signs, then it may be that you need to also lighten up and embrace a little more of your mutability, for example. The key thing that is the struggle for often with those in the mutable cross is they struggle with focus, confrontation, usually trying to avoid it, and synthesizing what appears to be disparate. But the magic, the power of the mutable cross is when you realize that because you signed up for the experiential course, that you want to take in the idea of experiences. As you start to synthesize the thread between those experiences, then you kind of forge a cohesive vision and goal that puts you even more along the path. And I know some may groan, Kim Kardashian, oh my God, why would you do this, right? Well, one of the things that stands out about her chart that's fascinating to me, at least, is that she's very much on a mutable cross, right? In terms of having mutable signs at her angles, including having a moon Jupiter opposition widely with Venus to the moon, but Jupiter also in detriment conjoined to her midheaven. So when I look at this chart, you know, this is someone, you know, who was introduced and framed in a way that often society puts as unsavory in terms of having a sex video, right? As if we all don't have sex videos, right? I don't know. But this, so there was a lot of shame that could have been attached to her. And also in terms of the things that she wanted to do. But then she didn't allow that to happen. And one thing that's interesting is that, you know, in terms of the different things that she has pursued, even over the last, 15, maybe 20 years that she's been in the public eye, maybe not even that long, but the 15 or so years, it's remarkable where all these things are. In fact, now she is still aspiring to be a lawyer, even though this is going to be an interesting test for her mutable cross, even though she failed a big exam for her first year of law school. So this is where she will have to test whether she's going to keep on persevering and take different baby steps and, you know, going with her sense of experience, because she has definitely signed up, which is probably why she also shows all these different pictures of herself for the experiential course. So like, this is what I'm doing now. Look at me eating. Wow, whatever. So this is something that also can be, that's something very key and attentive and intentional, often for those who are on the mutable cross. What about the What about the messy houses, though? What if you have a blend? When you have a mix of modalities on the angles, then you must really combine the meanings, which I'll talk about briefly. But one thing to remember when you have that, remember how each separate cross naturally blends into the other. How we may we go from cardinality, where we have to learn more sense of purpose, then we go to purpose, and then we have to learn to also let go. So that is something to keep in mind, and how they might at the same time be at odds with each other in the same chart, but there are still ways in which we can find the blend. This is a chart for someone, as you can see, who has, and I've left it with, I believe, Placidus, so that it's easier to see rather than the whole sign as I've done with the others. Their rising sign is Sagittarius, and then their midheaven is Scorpio. So this person, going to my next slide, and I'll come back to who this is in a second. As you can see, they're mutable fixed. This is a person who's operating along the fixed mutable axis, and they struggle between keeping to a sense of purpose and tossing aspects of life to the wind. And maybe a struggle where they kind of try to have that. Now, with this particular person, I will tell you, they haven't yet thrown much to the wind, but I think, they may come to struggle with that at some particular point. Who is this? This is Prince William. And even though he's now appearing as the steadfast son, he is second in line to the throne of England, to the the Kingdom of England, the UK. One of the things that may really crop up for him, especially being along this, is that I think he may at some point take on the trappings of tradition, but embrace it in a very different way. Again, testifying to this mutable axis that he's on in terms of his first house, seventh house, and then in terms of dealing with the fixity. So yes, he maintains a sense of tradition, or feels a sense of tradition, but he's going to do it in a way that is going to change it up in some way. And again, this is a dynamic you may see with the others. So with those who operate along the fixed cardinal fixed axis, the struggle between impulse control for what seems right in the moment and staying on the course you set, which often can be the struggle. And then again, for the cardinal mutable and the mutable cardinal, the struggle between pushing for maximum flexibility for options in life, which is what any good mutable would want, and feeling daunted by the weight of your own responsibility for making your own luck or opportunities, which is more the nature of cardinality. So when I say there's this struggle, the cross to bear, this is something that may crop up through your life. But here's what I do know from observing charts, from thinking about my own chart and mutability, is that you have refinement the more that you're paying attention to the struggle. You have refinement of the struggle. So it's not going to be about the same things as when you were 16, as when you're 56. There may be other factors that you can take in, other things that you can come to embrace that smooth over in time. My personal story, I mentioned some of the things that I've done. All of that, none of that, I should say, gets wasted in being an astrologer. I can tie in all of that and have an appreciation for the multiple ways in which I've walked life to help others walk in their lives, whether they're along the fixed cross, the cardinal cross, and the mutable cross. Similarly, if you're on the fixed cross, there are ways in which you've had a certain determination and fixity of purpose, and purpose that you're trying to manifest, and as a quote unquote crucified Christ, according to Bailey, that you also can share and give to others, even when you're not even trying. And in cardinal, you bring leadership often, action, sense of direction. It's just a matter of refining and shaping these things. So we're better bearing our crosses as we learn to bear them together, as we learn to bear them individually, as we also learn that we have crosses to bear. Because sometimes when you're not aware that you've signed up for the experiential course, right, to experience these different things, or the purposeful course, or the idea of pursuing, the sense of identity and cardinality, you just don't know. And this is the gift of astrology, to be able to know what path are we walking along in terms of being the pathfinder or purpose or experiential to embrace the larger sense of life? And so perhaps the essence of these other teachings I introduced can help us manage our expectations about the world and ourselves, and even, dare I say, change the world and make it better. And I think that is something, yes?
Oh, I just want to let you know that you have 10 minutes left.
And I'm done.
Oh.
So with that said, thank you. I want to thank Laura. I want to thank all of you for being at this conference. I can't wait until it's live. I have to tell you that if you had a beautiful experience during this virtual conference, then you only have a taste of what it's like being together. It's my favorite conference in terms of how we come together. I don't know if we're going to be at the same hotel when we come back, but we are. That hotel.
Before you zoom away, Sam, there was a really interesting question. Can I put that to you? It was
Yeah.
It says, I wonder if you can comment on differentiation of the cross from T-square within this context.
So T-square will manifest some part of it, and so we have the missing leg, right? So when I say the missing leg or missing part of it, when we have a T-square, just for those who may not know, we have two planets that are 180 degrees from each other that's square to one single one. They're jointly square. At the opposite end, though, usually there either is nothing, because then that would be a grand cross. So one way in which you come to integrate the dynamic or the dynamism, the tension between the planets involved in the T-square is where you direct your consciousness toward that focal point that's the opposite, right? To the actual planet the focal planet of the T-square. So if it's Aries, right, we have a dynamic between a planet in Capricorn and a planet in Cancer, and then we have something in Aries, then you're going to be directing your consciousness toward the lessons related to Libra and Venus. And your Venus in your chart may give you a clue about how you can approach that energy of Libra in your consciousness. And this is just along the cardinal cross. This is the same thing you could apply if that's a fixed T cross or T square, or if it's a mutable T square. That's how you would integrate it.
Zach, are you going to field some more questions from the chat room, or is Daniel?
Yeah, I certainly can. I was waiting for the right moment for that to pop in.
Find out who it is.
Yeah, this is the moment, I guess, because I can't see the chat. It's not showing up. And I'm going to stop my share for now, so now I can see it. So yeah, any other? I see one question, but I want to try to go in order.
You can answer the first question you see first, and then I can go to the next ones after that.
Okay. All right. So one I see, it's juicy, is from Autumn. Do you think people can experience the tensions in the combinations of quadruplicities when their sun or other important placement is different from that of their ascendant? Absolutely. And that's true even like with someone like William, true for someone like me. So I mentioned I'm on the mutable cross in terms of my chart, but my sun and my moon are in fixed signs. So, you know, there's a certain sense of doggedness that I may have, but my life circumstances have gone through a lot of different twists and turns. And there's always ways in which it changes. It could be the converse, where someone could be having fixed angles, but deal with mutability. So they have a lot of change, but they're frustrated because things don't change as easily or as often as they would like in terms of the external circumstances related to their lives. So that could become a challenge. How would you balance interpret grand crosses? I think that might be related to the T-square, because I think that's kind of, it basically comes to some of the same things. Okay.
Those were basically all of the questions that came through, the one that Patricia mentioned and the two ones that you had answered and looked at.
Yeah, I know this was a different talk than last year. I could be more of the preacher, but now I'm a little more of the teacher. And I think it's interesting to kind of explore the different dynamism. I mean, I have always benefited from realizing, and then this is studying the ageless wisdom teachings. When I understood the mutable cross related to the experiential course, I basically didn't have to feel bad about my sundry different experiences, right? I could realize like, oh, it probably never was going to be like a straight line for me, right? It was never going to be along this particular course, as well as like someone may, because they're on the fixed cross, wonder like, well, I wish my life were as colorful as this. I think to contemplate these things is a good way of avoiding envy. Envy is when you have decided that someone else's story is better than yours, rather than appreciating your story.
I'll say amen to that.
Amen. And you know what, Sam? Isn't preacher and teacher part of that whole mutable energy anyway?
There you go. Yeah. So thank you. Yeah, I thought I would tie in my other life, even as a preacher, related to the idea of the cross, but it's a different way of appreciating the cross.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, Sam.
Well, thank you.
We so appreciate you and your